Bodar Power, good morning everyone, and welcome to this exciting session. So this is on the developments in cancer research in Wales. During the session, if you can tweet during the session about the conference using the hashtag #ResearchWales21, that would be really appreciated. And throughout the session, if you could just ask your questions. If you look at the right hand side of your panel, you should see the ability to ask a question and also vote for the other questions that others have made, so that we can prioritise answering those for the experts this morning. My name's Professor Tom Crosby. I'm an oncologist at Velindre, and I'm Clinical Director for Cancer Services in Wales. But just before I introduce the speakers, I thought I'd just say a few words about how we're trying to develop a more coordinated and collaborative approach to cancer research in Wales through a cancer research strategy. So cancer research, as we know, is a key component of high quality cancer care, and we know that patient outcomes are better when delivered in a research rich environment. And we have a strong record of significant cancer research in Wales. But unfortunately, over recent years, there's been some decline in disinvestment, and particularly in clinical academic appointments. So there is evidence of reduced grant and funding capture. And we've also had a period where we've lost key clinical appointments, either through inability to retain key personnel in Wales, but also sadly with the death of a few eminent research leads. And all of this has contributed to, for example, the loss of our CRUK Cancer Centre status. So the current position clearly needs us to address these deficits and for the benefit of Welsh cancer patients. And so we have made a commitment to the development of a cancer research strategy in Wales. This was a key expectation of the most recent cancer delivery plan, and also was a key recommendation of the CRUK review document on the state of cancer services in Wales. So over the last 18 months, there's been fantastic engagement with the wider clinical community. We've developed a really helpful approach to key areas that needed to be addressed in research in Wales. However, it was less clear on how the detail of how we would build on existing research strengths in Wales and have a coordinated approach to greater support from NHS organisations, HEIs and external funders. So we sought an external review from an esteemed panel of UK research leads who confirmed the need really for a more focused approach, focusing on depth rather than breadth of research. But they did recognise key themes of research strengths in Wales and recommended that they should be further developed and work more closely together. So we've developed a number of recommendations to achieve this more focused approach in research. Importantly, however, though, this does not preclude the support and promotion of wider cancer research activity or the development of new and emerging areas of cancer research. So the ultimate aim is to develop a critical mass and a sustainable platform for cancer research for the priority themes from which other strengths can then emerge. The recommended themes also offer opportunities for those themes for research collaboration in cancer and with non-cancer research, as well as with third sector and industry partners. So critical to this strategy, we recognise that will be to get key cancer and research organisations, Welsh Government, health boards, trusts, higher education institutions to sign up to the direction of travel and to work together to empower these research leaders to take on the required roles and responsibilities. So we have made it very clear to these organisations that CES will require investment to reverse the current situation and ultimately make Wales a more attractive place to be invested in by research funders. It is proposed that the Wales Cancer Research Centre should play a leading role in implementing this strategy. And I'm absolutely sure that our three speakers this morning are going to play key roles in delivering this really important work. So the first speaker will be Professor Anthony Byrne, Clinical Director of Curie Palliative Care Centre. Anthony is a consultant in palliative medicine based in Cardiff and Vale University Health Board, an honorary professor at Cardiff University, where he's clinical director of the Marie Curie Palliative Care Research Centre. and he leads a patient-focused research work stream at the Wales Cancer Research Centre, where he is a member of the executive committee. He also works nationally with the NCRI clinical studies and strategic advisory groups. So the second speaker will be Professor Mererid Evans, who is a consultant clinical oncologist at Velindre Cancer Centre, clinical R&D lead there, and is also leading the research developments through the Velindre Futures programme. She is now Chief Investigator of 3 multi-centre and international clinical trials, aiming to develop kinder treatments for patients with head and neck cancer. And I'm pleased to announce that she is also the newly appointed Director of Health and Care Research Wales, and she will lead the strategic leadership group that I mentioned earlier to oversee the implementation, the development and implementation of the National Cancer Research Strategy. And I'm sure that I know she has, and will continue to work closely with our final speaker, Professor Awen Gallimore, who is co-director of Systems Immunity and Research Institute in Cardiff University. So Owen is a professor in Cardiff University. Before coming to Cardiff, she trained and worked in Professor Andrew McMichael's laboratory in Oxford, and the Nobel laureate Professor Rolf Zinkelnagel in Zurich to further study factors important to generating immunity to research infections. She moved to run her lab in Cardiff in 2002, where she currently receives funding from Cancer Research UK, Cancer Research Wales and the Wellcome Trust to perform discovery science, but importantly also aims to convert this basic science through testing of novel immunotherapies in patients with cancer into the clinical setting. So with that, I'm going to hand over now to Professor Anthony Byrne, who will give us our first talk. Please do use the question, the ask the question function in the right-hand columns, and we will try to curate those as the speakers talk, and we will come to questions at the end of this session. Thank you.
That's great, Tom. Thank you very much for the opportunity to describe the supportive and palliative care elements of the strategy that you've just outlined. And what I wanted to do today was just to spend a little bit of time explaining to everybody the model that we've developed from a support and palliative care perspective, and how we believe that paradigm will support the developments in cancer research in Wales moving forward. And it's fair to say that from a palliative care perspective, we're a very small specialty, and particularly from a research perspective, we've got a very small footprint with very little redundancy in the system. So we've had to engage over time in being very flexible and creative in how we've developed our model. And in particular, we've had to learn quickly and integrate to create that critical mass so that we can sustainably deliver. And that's against the background of wanting to achieve an intervention-based clinical focus with complex interventions, but also in very heterogeneous populations. So it has been challenging, but hopefully we'll be able to describe how we've succeeded and how that might underpin how we move forward. And one of our early focuses was on developing, through collaboration and through our own expertise, the range of excellence that we require for that kind of multi-perspective approach to assessing complex interventions. So, we grew up in the what was the Wales Cancer Trials Unit and now the Centre for Trials Research, which helped us with our understanding and our delivery of early and late phase trial design. We've worked very closely with the SURE unit in terms of developing our expertise in evidence synthesis, and we have now a international reputation in terms of complex interventions and outcomes design, as well as the very important element of implementation science at the far end of the spectrum in terms of knowledge transfer. And that's been built up over a decade of collaborations and purposeful interactions with a range of methodologists, including MRC hubs, and particularly the Bristol MRC Conduct Methodology Hub, which has been so supportive in particular of GI work, through our UK and international collaborations with palliative and supportive care colleagues, but also with guidelines groups such as the American Society of Hematology and outcomes groups in oncology. and very importantly for us, a range of funders from NIH, RHTA and RFPB through charities in particular, a very important relationship through funding cycles with Marie Curie and industry as well. But I guess that the proof of the pudding really is in the production, and what it has allowed us to do is develop our ability in terms of phase 3 and feasibility study, high impact study, delivery and publications. It's also allowed us to work on outcomes and outcomes delivery and screening tools. And this is a great example of a screening tool developed by Anne-Marie Nelson for late effects of pelvic radiotherapy that was adopted by the Royal College of Radiologists and led to an implementation study of managing the late effects of pelvic radiotherapy in conjunction with Professor John Stafford. And we've also been able to deliver in terms of policy impact as well, and most recently through the work of Emily Harrop, our Senior Research Associate, and the work she did on COVID bereavement, which has been the basis of policy implementation both at Whitehall and within a national bereavement framework in Wales. So it's been a very challenging environment, but one in which we hope we've demonstrated the ability to deliver. And it's certainly been a proving ground of what multi-perspective collaboration can bring. And I think in the current context, it's also left us reliably informed in interpreting the lessons of COVID as well. And I think that there are many lessons to take away from COVID. One being, if you focus on one thing and put all your resources into that, perhaps we can deliver. But more importantly, I think it's shown what can happen when funders and institutions break down the pressures of competitiveness and allow people to work together. And I think the combat paper that I've displayed on the left-hand side is fantastic, not simply for the content of it, but just for the front page in terms of just look at the number of collaborators there and what they can teach us in terms of how we use that multiple perspective and multidimensional approach to problem solving. And it strikes me that Wales, from a size and a systems point of view, is well based from a cancer perspective to take those individual angles of excellence in terms of multi-omics and modalities to focus in on a broader lens of how we approach problem solving. And I particularly included that multi-centric approach related to from the patient perspective, but also Wales has a world-leading value-based healthcare program led by Professor Sally Lewis. So it gives us the opportunity to be truly multidimensional in our approach. So fine words, but how do we actually deliver that in reality? And from a support and palliative care perspective, working within the Wales Cancer Research Centre, we are basing our work plans within a multi-perspective analysis of a smart MDT concept that we've developed within the Wales Cancer Research Centre. And that's based on the clinical reality of the shifting sands of how cancer MDTs are working. And this is kind of cartoon demonstrates what we would consider as a traditional MDT model, and I've sat at many of these meetings as part of lung and upper GI MDTs, where we discuss patients and particularly their tumours as radiology images and as pathology pictures. But the explosion in our understanding of driving mutations and precision medicine that has guided more targeted treatments has been both exciting and at times overwhelming. And anybody who sits at MDTs now will be aware of being drenched in information in relation just to genomics and driving mutations alone, never mind radiomic and other perspectives. And so the human brain can only cope with 5 pieces of information in making a decision. So for an MDT to correlate all that information, it really requires support, and that support is coming, and I'm thankful to Emiliano Spezzi for this cartoon. It's coming in the form of the kind of clinical interaction with computer-aided diagnostics and AI, where we will be receiving algorithmic information in terms of predictions of which treatments will suit particular driving mutations and how they interact with other elements of tumor behavior. But what is missing from that, from my perspective and from a support and palliative care perspective, in terms of personalized medicine, is the person at the center of all of that. And so that's where we are basing our focus in terms of an integrated, multi-perspective approach to how we refine the treatment of patients in that context. And for me to do that from a support and palliative care point of view, if I'm to be true to the paradigm I've suggested that we should be using in terms of a wider angle lens on problem solving, I need to understand what's happening in Wales and what the opportunities are, both in terms of, there's been a huge explosion and we're probably reaching the crescendo of our understanding of driver mutations. But what about a more focused, personalized approach for the individual? So, for example, screening for an individual what the likely mechanisms of resistance are likely to be and what the next treatment option will be. And in the midst of all the excitement over pharmacological interventions, let's not forget about the importance of multi-modality radiotherapy drug approaches, which Mererid will talk about shortly. And of course, the excitement around immuno-oncology, which Awen will bring us through, and I think we'll conclude in terms of how much more there is to do. And from a support and palliative perspective, how can I influence that? Well, what we're really interested in doing is looking at the physiology and the phenotypical elements of the patient that might influence the tumor algorithm in terms of treatment options. And particularly, if the patient has a huge comorbidity and a very obvious deficit, that's pretty straightforward. But in reality, patients usually have smaller cumulative deficits that ultimately overwhelm their ability to homeostatically manage treatment modalities. And so if we can better predict those for Owen and for Mererid and others, then we can influence the algorithm into a very specifically, rather than just precision, personalized treatment plan. And at the heart of all of that, ultimately, comes the focus of the patient at the center of all this, and the patient in control of decision making, so that they can make their choices based on the context of their own lives and their lived experience at the time. And from the Wales Cancer Research perspective, we are working to do that through the treatment and care domain. And we are working alongside multiple colleagues across what I think have been brilliant and prescient developments of multidisciplinary research groups developed by Richard Clarkson and John Chester and others, which have predated the change in the NCRI strategy to something away from clinical studies groups to something very similar. And it's been an absolute delight to be sitting at a table with clinicians, basic scientists, and qualitative researchers, all giving their own angle on that particular problem-solving issue. And I just wanted to emphasize that from a support and palliative care point of view, we are particularly focused on the non-curative perspective, and particularly around systemic anti-cancer treatment in a non-curative perspective. And this is the sort of thing we want to do. I've given this example in upper GI cancers, but it could relate to all of the modalities that I've just mentioned and across tumor types. And what we are particularly interested in doing is looking at patient phenotype and physiology across a number of classes of imaging, of circulating biomolecules, and of function, all of which can be routinely collected, so that we can better understand at baseline what those characteristics classify in terms of the likelihood of a patient tolerating a particular treatment intervention. And from an imaging point of view, working alongside colleagues like Emiliano Spezzi and Kieran Foley from a radiomics point of view, so that we can better classify lean body mass and muscle quality. And then with our colleagues both clinically and in the Centre for Trials Research to collect the routine data, and our nursing colleagues and physiotherapy colleagues to collect functional data. And there's good international evidence around the impact of lean body mass and sarcopenia on outcomes, as there are with circulating biomolecules. And we ourselves have been able to do a very simple short physical performance battery test in very busy rapid access clinics, and been able to demonstrate that from baseline we're able to predict adverse outcomes in terms of toxicities and lack of completion of treatment in lung cancer patients. And what hasn't happened is that we have not been able to take those individual areas and those individual domains of perspective and bring them together into a multidimensional algorithm that allows us to understand a patient's resilience for particular treatment, but also that we might identify those modifiable targets of frailty that we can improve over time, and that as resistance develops, for example, or immunotherapy becomes an option, that we can define which ones they will be able to tolerate. And to further develop an iterative model of learning as treatment options change. But I just wanted to put a word in for patients who do badly, who are rarely the focus of multi-center research, and our responsibility from a supportive and palliative care point of view to better support our multi-omics colleagues to understand why those patients are doing so badly, and that when we're seeing patients from a palliative perspective, we've got a real opportunity to take data and samples back into the arena of Awen and Mererid and others, so that we can better understand those patients' poor outcomes. And having used research to identify the algorithm and classifiers that are going to work for us in terms of that predictability, we've got to be able to translate that raw routine data into something that's processed and standardized and can become part of that iterative learning. And I'm delighted that we are working with Kevin Ashleford from the Institute of Genetics, and Kevin is a bioinformatics specialist who has done a tremendous amount of work in engaging with the new all-encompassing national data resource in Wales, which houses all patient data, and is exploring with the advanced analytical groups there how we could access that routine data and process it into a meaningful classifier of patient resilience. But just as importantly, again, to emphasize that that's not work that's happening in isolation, and that Kevin is working across a range of domains so that we can share with each other. And I highlight at the bottom some work that Sunil Dalwani is doing with that multi-perspective approach, similar to ours, but at the opposite end of the patient spectrum. And so from the patient point of view, Anne-Marie Nelson has consistently led an excellent stream of work over a long period of time in relation to patient understanding of the choices that they have and how to contextualize those choices, and showed in the lung cancer PACT study that we miss opportunities right along the diagnostic pathway to better prepare patients for that shared decision making and to understand how they bring their priorities and preferences to the table. So along with Michelle Edwards and Daniela Holland-Hart, she's undertaking a series of interventions and work to look at how we can better bring the patient to the center of that conversation, and that the patient frames the consultation rather than the tumor framing the consultation. And really importantly, she's working alongside the single patient pathway work streams within the Wales Cancer Network, which has major implications for how we would translate that more widely within the UK along the national optimal pathways. And in parallel with the work on patient resilience, is looking to integrate that data more effectively within health systems and within the MDT, so that narrative wraps around the MDT algorithms that I've just described. So I hope, in summary, that I've made the case for a more multidimensional approach rather than a single angle approach to the personalised plan, and hopefully fairly explicitly demonstrated that it fits within the strategic direction for healthcare in Wales, and very particularly within the value-based approach to how we implement it. Thanks very much. And I'm going to hand on now to Professor Mererid Evans, who's our newly appointed Director of the Wales Cancer Research Centre. Thank you.
Thanks, Anthony. There we go. I was just waiting for my slides. So thanks, Anthony. Bore da bawb. Mae'n bleser I fod yma. It's a real delight to be here, and I'd like to thank Health and Care Research Wales for the invitation. So we have all been consumed over the last 18 months by SARS-CoV-2, the virus that causes COVID-19, and it's easy to forget that there are other viruses out there that have a global impact. But in fact, viruses cause around 15% of all human cancers worldwide. Examples are Hpv, the first virus found in a human cancer by 2 British scientists, Epstein and Barr, and human papillomavirus, Hpv, initially discovered to be the cause of cervical cancer and now known to cause other cancers, including anal cancer and head and neck cancers affecting the tonsils and the throat. These cancers usually occur years or even decades after primary infection. I'll turn briefly to Hpv because we have a really strong track record of Hpv research in Wales. This map shows that over 2/3 of the global cervical cancer burden occurs in developing countries, so that's sub-Saharan Africa mainly. Screening has reduced the incidence of cervical cancer in developed countries like the UK, and HPV vaccination introduced for 11 to 13-year-old girls in the UK in 2008 should reduce that burden further in the future. You can see from this blue map that in contrast to cervical cancer, HPV-related head and neck cancers occur predominantly in developed countries, including the UK, North America, Europe and Australia. And this has been described as an epidemic of a virus-related carcinoma. What's the situation in Wales? Well, as the blue line on the graph shows, tonsil and throat cancers occur mainly in men and have trebled in incidence over 15 years. And now exceeds the incidence of cervical cancer in Wales. When I was a new consultant, and that was a long time ago now, but seeing more and more patients coming into the clinic with these kinds of cancers, I set up a study with Ned Powell, Dr. Ned Powell at Cardiff University, which was funded by Cancer Research Wales to collect pathology blocks from affected patients to look for HPV. And you can see in these slides on the right, the middle slide, the brown there, indicates that HPV is present. And in fact, we found that the majority of the cancers that we tested were positive for HPV. Our study in Wales led to a UK study which tested cancers from patients across all 4 UK nations, generating data on the magnitude of the problem that ultimately influenced the JCVI statement to introduce HPV vaccination to boys as well as girls in the UK. And I think this shows the power of research and our research in Wales. So we know that vaccination can prevent infection if given before exposure to a virus. However, can we use vaccines to treat cancers that have already developed? And the answer to that is yes. And there are a number of these therapeutic vaccines in development. And I know that Owen will tell you more about that. What I find really amazing is that scientists are now using viruses as cancer vaccines. And Alan Parker and his team at Cardiff University have engineered adenoviruses to specifically recognise, infect and kill cancer cells, generating anti-cancer immune responses. So we have viruses that cause cancer and we have viruses that can be used to treat cancer, the full circle. Developing cancer vaccines is a central mission of the UK Life Sciences vision, and we're in a great place in Wales to do that with the immunology and virotherapy expertise that we have here. So I believe it's a good time to be involved in cancer research in Wales. We have potential in many areas, and as Tom has said, CRESS, the Cancer Research Strategy for Wales, has identified specific themes, so 6 themes where we can develop excellent research. One of these is radiotherapy, which is my main area of research interest. And for those of you who don't know, radiotherapy uses high energy rays, usually X-rays from a linear accelerator, to target cancers, causing damage to the DNA, which if it's not repaired, leads to cell death. And we have a really strong tradition of leading clinical radiotherapy trials across a number of cancer sites in Wales, including upper GI cancers, head and neck cancers, brain cancers, prostate cancers, with chief investigators coming from all 3 of the cancer centres in Wales. I lead 3 radiotherapy clinical trials for patients with head and neck cancer. Now, I've already mentioned that the goal with HPV vaccination is ultimately to eradicate HPV cancers, but for the next 20 to 30 years, we expect to continue to see an increasing number of affected patients coming into our clinics, and they need treatment. This is one of the studies that we've set up to develop better treatments. Pathos, which is funded by Cancer Research UK's Stand Up to Cancer campaign. In this study, patients undergo minimally invasive surgery using a laser or robot before having reduced doses of radiotherapy and chemotherapy. The aim is to reduce the intensity of treatment, ultimately to develop kinder treatments for patients with head and neck cancer. So pathos has grown beyond our wildest expectations, and the study, which is led from the CTR at Cardiff University, and I've put a picture here of our amazing trial manager, Chris, is co-sponsored by Velindre and Cardiff University. It's now open across 36 UK sites, across 8 international sites, and is about to open in Stanford University in California, which is really exciting, and I think an example of what we can lead and run from Wales. Another radiotherapy study that I lead with a team from Velindre and PETIC, the PET Centre in Wales, which is funded by Cancer Research UK and Moondance through the Velindre charity, is Pearl. So here patients have standard doses of radiotherapy and chemotherapy, but this time we're aiming to reduce the volume of normal tissues that receive high doses of radiotherapy, and we're doing that by doing a PET CT scan midway through a course of radiotherapy, seeing which patients are responding, and then shrinking down the high dose radiotherapy volume, which you can see in the green there on the pictures, to reduce toxicity. Once again, developing kinds of treatments for patients with head and neck cancer. I believe we have enormous potential if we take the clinical radiotherapy excellence that we have in Wales and work across the CREST themes with our scientists. This is an example of where we're starting to do just that. The Sabre IT project, which is a collaboration between Velindre clinicians and the immunology laboratory led by Owen in Cardiff University. Radiotherapy has been called an in situ cancer vaccine because the cell death and the damage that it causes stimulates the immune response. What Sabre IT is aiming to do is to interrogate the effect of radiotherapy on immune cells in the blood before and after ablative radiotherapy to identify targets for future phase 1 studies of radiotherapy combined with immune modulating agents. Another area for development in the future is imaging. I've already mentioned PETIC, the PET Centre. We also have Curie, Cardiff University's Brain Research Imaging Centre, which is an amazing facility with world-class imaging capabilities, which are so far underutilised for cancer research in Wales. So this is the neurocognitive function study, a collaboration between Velindre and Cardiff University, where multi-parametric MRI scans of the brain were taken before and after stereotactic radiosurgery, and the changes seen on MRI were correlated with radiation dosimetry and neurocognition. And the pictures are amazing, I think, and the potential of this research is huge. So radiotherapy lends itself to research which overlaps with innovation in data, automation and AI. This, together with using better imaging to understand the microstructural and biological effects of radiotherapy, and using our scientific expertise in immunology to interrogate the effect of radiotherapy on the immune system, and combining cancer vaccines and other immunotherapies with radiotherapy, are exciting avenues of future research that can underpin the combination cancer therapies of the future. I've already said that I think it's an exciting time to be involved in cancer research in Wales, and it really is. Developing immunotherapies, cancer vaccines and other novel agents in the lab, and then delivering them to patients in the clinic needs the right infrastructure. And we're currently working very, very hard to develop that in Wales. So Cardiff and Vale, Velindre and Cardiff University have come together in a joint endeavour to establish a tripartite research hub, which will increase patient access to research, especially experimental research, strengthen the translational pipeline, that critical link between the laboratory, discovery science and the clinic, develop a focus for cancer research excellence in Wales, enable training, education and innovation, house Welsh research infrastructure and be a hub for industrial partnerships, and we believe much, much more. Okay, so just finally, the priorities as I see them for cancer research in Wales are to build a sustainable, internationally competitive portfolio of cancer research focused on a few key themes where Wales can make a unique contribution and build critical mass. I think we need to work together as a One Wales team of researchers across different institutions, the NHS and academia, across different disciplines and diverse skills. We need also to look outwards to establish effective research partnerships and networks across the UK and wider afield. We have to establish the translational pipeline between the laboratory and the clinic, developing infrastructure will help us do that, but also establishing career pathways for future research leaders, both clinical in the NHS, academic in our universities, and clinical academic that bridge between both. What we can achieve if we do that is a thriving, connected cancer research community in Wales, an identity and focus for cancer research in Wales so that everybody knows what we're about. I believe that that will bring inward investment, ensuring sustainability and benefiting our economy. We will hopefully have a positive legacy to hand on to the next generation of researchers and cancer patients in Wales. And most importantly of all, we will generate health benefits for cancer research, for cancer patients and the public across the whole of Wales. Although not all research can be done everywhere, the benefits of research must reach patients across the whole of Wales. So, as Thomas said, I will be taking on the role of Director of the Wales Cancer Research Centre in November, and I'm slightly terrified but also really excited at that prospect. So the WCRC is an established and valued part of the cancer research infrastructure in Wales. It's funded by Health and Care Research Wales. It was set up in 2015, and there is an amazing team already involved with it. I think what it does is it makes people feel part of something bigger, and it is the vehicle to influence a harnessed approach for a joined up One Wales approach to cancer research, to realise opportunities to develop new infrastructure for cancer research in Wales, to champion the cancer research workforce, which really does have to have investment to develop the research leads of the future, and to promote and drive the implementation of CREST for patients and researchers in Wales, working closely with Health and Care Research Wales, with institutions across Wales, because everybody will need to be engaged to ensure that it is successful. So finally, I'd just like to acknowledge some of the researchers in Wales and beyond that have helped me along my research journey, and I'd like to thank you all for listening. Diolch yn fawr iawn. I'm now going to hand over to Professor Awen Gallimore.
Great. Thank you very much, Tom and Mererid, for your introductions. And as Tom mentioned, I am an immunologist. I'm a scientist at Cardiff University. And so the focus of my presentation will be on cancer immunotherapy. And I'm sure many of you already have seen the newspaper headlines over the last few years which enthuse about this new type of therapy called immunotherapy, which describes basically using the body's immune system to fight cancer. And we know that this can work, extremely well. It's been used successfully to treat the ex-American president, Jimmy Carter. And what you're looking at on the other part of the screen are the lungs of a lady from South Wales who was successfully treated with immunotherapy for her metastatic melanoma. And the story, I think, behind these headlines is very interesting. Why is immunotherapy such a new thing? And why do we suddenly have so much sort of excitement about it? And it's kind of especially curious when, you consider that the idea of using the immune system to kill cancer has actually been around for at least 150 years. You're looking here at William Coley. He was a bone surgeon at the Memorial Hospital in New York, and he noticed that when patients had infections, then this was often associated with a regression of their cancer. So he put forward the idea that some sort of immune response to the infection was having an anti-cancer effect. And this then started him along the course of injecting patients with live and then dead bacteria and seeing that this could sometimes lead to cancer regression. But it was met with, huge opposition. His boss at the time was James Ewing, and he was not very keen at all to drive forward this new type of therapy, and much more interested in putting forward radiation or chemotherapy as novel treatments for cancer. William Coley did, however, have one very staunch and very effective supporter, and this was his daughter, Helen Coley. She was actually a housewife. She had no formal scientific training whatsoever, but she was a huge advocate of her dad's. And so she, together with another doctor called Cornelius Rhodes, they actually established the Cancer Research Institute in America in 1953. And the purpose of this institute was to harness the body's immune system rather than one that seeks chemicals and radiation to attack the disease. But in spite of the efforts of these key individuals and others, it still was the case for decades that cancer and the immune system remained, in fact, very uneasy bedfellows. And this is summed up here by a very eminent cancer immunologist called Rob Schreiber, who said, "The argument went, the immune system plays no role in treating cancer, and any scientist who thought otherwise was wasting valuable time and energy." So it was very difficult, even 20, 30 years ago, to be a cancer immunologist, actually. So what's changed then, and why has it been so difficult for this concept to gain acceptance? Well, what we know is that the main job of the immune system is undoubtedly to fight infection. It's there to protect us against a variety of different pathogens. And it does this because when a bug comes along, the immune system reacts to this by putting up a so-called go signal. So that's the little green spot that you're seeing there. And once an immune cell does that, it tells other immune cells to join in, and they proliferate and they become activated until they manage to clear that bug. So what happens when an immune cell sees a piece of normal tissue, such as this little pink strip along the right-hand side of the slide, is that it now no longer puts up a green go signal, it puts up a red stop signal. And of course it does that in order to maintain balance within the immune system to stop it from attacking normal uninfected tissue. Now, of course, cancer appears to the immune system often as normal uninfected tissue. So it responds to that, unfortunately, by putting up these sort of red stop signals. And really, it was by sort of understanding this and knowing about the molecular sort of identity of these stop and go signals that really transformed, you know, our ability to exploit the immune system in order to make it see cancer. And as a result of these discoveries, we've now managed to generate antibodies that can block these red stop signals and turn the immune system into one that's essentially switched on. And what treating patients with these antibodies has now enabled is the cure of what were previously incurable diseases. And these discoveries then were recognised by the award of the Nobel Prize only in 2018. This was to Tasuku Honjo and Jim Allison for the discovery of these stop and go signals. And when Jim Allison was interviewed, you know, about his Nobel Prize, he said, "I was really just trying to understand the immune system." And I think, you know, this is a very important point because, you know, we're living in a world where there's an increasing emphasis on a quick return. You know, a common question is, where will you be in 3 years' time? But I think what this type of science actually shows is that an effective path to transformational new treatments is paved by understanding the underpinning biology. And so this is the type of work that requires, you know, patience, and the returns may not come within 5 or 10 years, but they do eventually come. There is, of course, still a long way to go. Immunotherapy still has many limitations. It's successful only for some patients. It's successful only for certain types of cancer. It's often toxic because, of course, you're unleashing an immune response against uninfected tissue, which brings with it toxic off-target effects. So there are still many, many challenges that need to be risen to. But the scope and opportunities for improvement are enormous. And I think that we are rising to this challenge in Wales. As Mererid has already said, immuno-oncology has been identified as a priority research theme. And this is based, of course, on the ongoing strength of research activity in this area. So we're already delivering so-called adoptive T-cell therapies. And these are T-cell therapies given to patients which consist of genetically modified immune cells that are capable of seeking out and destroying cancers. And this particular approach is credited initially to an American researcher called Carl June. And as written on this slide, he said the first CAR trial was actually in HIV patients, not cancer. A lot of people don't know that. The trials were stopped in '97 when protease inhibitors for HIV came out. So this type of treatment was no longer required. And the point of me sort of telling you this and pointing this out is to emphasize, you know, the importance of sharing expertise and knowledge, you know, drawing on those experts who work on virus infections and who are immunologists in order to develop new treatments for cancer. So linked to CAR T cells, basic research conducted here in Wales is focused on understanding which tiny bits of cancer are actually seen by the immune system, really getting sort of stuck into the molecular details of what constitutes immune recognition of a cancer cell. And then you can use this information in order to improve methods of engineering your immune cells to make them even better for future therapies. These, of course, are rather flashy approaches, but we're also exploring how old chemotherapy drugs can be used differently. So Cancer Research Wales supported a clinical study to test the idea that when you use a traditional chemotherapy drug at a very low dose, then this is actually enough to tickle the immune system in a way that makes it more effectively target cancer. And this is a very non-toxic treatment and a very, very cheap but yet potentially very effective treatment. And this is ongoing work that holds promise as an effective way of preventing disease recurrence for several different types of cancers. As Mererid said, we're also putting energy into looking for new approaches to the development of cancer vaccines. And we have a proud legacy of this, as Mererid already mentioned, of cancer vaccine work in Cardiff. So Leslie Borisovich performed Europe's first trial of a vaccine for human papillomavirus in the 1990s. And you know that vaccines, of course, work by stimulating the immune system. They generate T-cell responses, antibody responses, and the idea is that these then can go off, recognise and eliminate tumours. But what's really special about the immune system compared to other types of therapies is that the immune system has a thing called immunological memory. So once you trigger it, once you've got your antibodies and you've got your T cells and they can recognise bits of cancer cells, then when those cancers come back, they'll still be there, and hopefully they should remember that they're meant to recognise and kill that invader. So this is immunity, and the hope is that if we generate immunity in the right way, we can then prevent cancer recurrence. And we're now in a much better position to do a better job than what we could do in the 1990s. We know a great deal more about how the immune system interacts with cancer. We're also in a great position to build on the success of COVID vaccines, you know, Pfizer vaccines, AstraZeneca vaccines. These have become, you know, household names now. Which one did you get? You know, it's important to recognise, though, that the infrastructures and technologies that were put in place to develop these vaccines were actually originally put in place to develop cancer vaccines. So it's imperative now to make use of the momentum that's generated through tackling COVID to return to the cancer vaccine cause. So what I've shown you, I think, represents just the tip of the iceberg of global sort of cancer immunology research. But what I hope I've managed to get across is that Wales plays a significant part in this effort. And there's enormous potential to grow this success. Of course, this needs the integrated efforts and collaboration with the public, with patients, with clinicians, with scientists, and also with scientists of many, many different disciplines. As Anthony and Mererid have already alluded to, you know, we need engineers, imagers, computational expertise, as well as the traditional cancer biologists and immunologists. That's how we'll understand what solutions are needed and how we can transform our bench side discoveries, you know, into new treatments for patients. So I've included my email address here. So if you think of questions outside of this session today, then you're please very welcome to get in touch with me about any of that. Thank you.
So thank you to all of our speakers. Really excellent talks, and also thank you for keeping excellently to time. So we do have 10 minutes or so now for some questions, and we've got a couple that are coming through. So I think there's been a lot of support, Anthony, for your advocacy for patients and population-based information and data to be integrated more with, you know, the typical disease and treatment sort of omics that we look at. And you did cover it in your talk, but what are the key elements of trying to have that wider integration of science and cancer research?
I think there's three elements to it, really, Tom. Initially, with the development of the kind of precision predictive models based on radiogenomics, it felt like the patient perspective was actually going to get lost in MDTs because we would be so focused on those algorithms. But actually, what I've come to understand is that what the MDT needs is exactly that objective and reliable description of the patient perspective from a physiological point of view and from a personal experience point of view. And so, ironically, I think the move to that data heavy approach with MDTs and how we analyze that gives us an opportunity to actually be much more discreet in how we describe the potential of patients to withstand treatment that goes way beyond the simple, well, what's their performance status yesterday in clinic, which may predict overall survival, but is a very poor predictor of treatment tolerance. So I think this is a unique opportunity for us to describe the patient in a much more comprehensive, multi-angled way that's going to influence treatment very positively. I think sometimes when I describe this work, people feel very negatively about it in the context of perhaps, you know, stopping people having treatment. It's not about withholding treatment. It's about describing what's the right treatment for that patient at that particular point in the treatment pathway. And the other particularly important element is how we use routine data in the way that I described through Kevin Ashelford's work to provide something that's routinely and iteratively described at MDT so that we can learn with each change in the treatment plan.
Thank you, Anthony. A question for Mererid. You mentioned, I think, in your last slide about the one, you know, developing this one Wales approach, and we heard from the plenary session, you know, about how some research has been put on hold, but some of it has been actually accelerated, you know, through the pandemic. And you know, we've seen that in research with Siren, and recent study I've been involved with Grail, where we've had a single sponsor for Wales, and all the R&D departments in Wales have worked really closely together, you know, to recruit 1,000 patients, setting up a trial within 2 months and recruiting 1,000 patients over a few months. So I guess, how do we promote that approach and not lose that momentum that we talked about this morning? There's also been a question about, also, you know, if you could include in that, how do we address some of the inequities of access to clinical research across the geography of Wales?
Okay, so I think I remember all of that question, but I think the first part of the question was around a One Wales approach, and I think that there are multiple aspects to that. But you know, the obvious one you've already talked about, which is around the delivery of clinical research, and the Grail study that you talked about is a really, really good example where a simple blood test is being used to detect multiple types of cancer. There is one coordinating NHS organisation, so that's Velindre. There is a principal investigator based in Swansea, Professor Dean Harris, and then all the health boards in Wales have just gone with it, and the study has done incredibly well. How do we not go back? I think it would be crazy to go back. Why would we do things differently, you know, when we've seen that this is so effective, but we need to maintain the momentum? You know, certainly from an R&D perspective at Velindre, who are coordinating Grail, or Simplify as it's called now for Wales, you know, the whole place is buzzing. I don't think it will go back, because this is the way that we feel that things should be done in future. And, you know, when other organisations lead, you know, as the kind of lead coordinating sites, then, you know, we would support in the same kind of way. So I think that's one element of the One Wales approach. I think also in terms of the science and the research being undertaken, we have got to stop competing between academic and NHS organisations in Wales, you know, between Cardiff and Swansea and Bangor. You know, we are a population of I'm going to get this wrong now in this conference, which won't be good, about 3.5 million people. We should be one team of researchers that is doing the research that our population needs. And I think the Wales Cancer Research Centre is a really positive force for good to bring researchers together. I think CREST will help because it will focus minds and we'll be able to articulate what we're all about, I hope. In terms of the second part of the question, that is a really difficult one. How do we get to harder to reach communities? I think that, and as I said in my talk, the benefits of research, even if the research isn't carried out everywhere, has to be, equitably delivered to patients everywhere. So, it depends on good engagement with delivery teams across the whole of Wales, but also I think it's broader than what we can do as health boards and trusts and universities. We need to work with local authorities, with schools, with communities. To get the information out there, because people need to know that there is this research going on, and then they need to be demanding that they have access to it. And then, there will, I'm hopeful, be even better engagement across the whole of Wales. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, and I think people will be really excited by, your vision, ambition, aspiration for Wales. So thanks for that, Mererid. Awen, if I can come to you. So you spoke within your talk, and I know you're very passionate about how we join up clinical research across the research pathway. So linking basic science with clinical research facilities. So I wonder if you could just sort of say, what do you think are the priorities for that? But one of the questions has been about, how we fill the academic gap in Wales. So, how do we promote clinicians, not just medics, to combine research and clinical careers? Can you address that, Awen?
Yes, well, I think there's two things, isn't there, two broad things. One is translational studies and the other is sort of early phase clinical studies. And, when people think about clinical research, they tend to think about those early phase clinical studies. But I'd like to make a bit of a pitch for the translational study here. So this is really just, it's almost like an observational study, where you're potentially trying to find out what the impact of radiotherapy, let's say, is on the immune system. So it's incredible how little we know about, the immunobiology of radiotherapy. And, in order to get this information, what we need to be doing is when patients come in and receive a course of radiotherapy treatment, we need to be measuring immune responses at different time points during that course of radiotherapy, at the end of it, to understand how does it impact on the immune system, and at which point, therefore, would it be good to combine their radiotherapy with an immunotherapy to give them a better chance of successful treatment. And so this is about making sure that this is seen by everybody as an important goal, isn't it? And making sure that the clinicians who are treating the patients and the nurses who are also part of the team have the time to engage with us, the researchers, to enroll people into studies, to do the necessary paperwork, to collect the bloods, to link with the lab and so on. So it's about protected research time and making research part of those, part of the day, part of the plan. So I think, that's very, very important. And I think, if you make research almost like a normal part of a patient's experience when they come in, for example, let's say to Velindre for treatment, then this will have a self-amplifying effect whereby research culture becomes sort of more embedded in that sort of clinical environment. And we're able to collect more information more quickly with hopefully a good return eventually for patients.
Thank you, Owen. That's a really excellent answer, and I know your passion comes across for linking those different aspects of the research. We're running out of time. We have to finish at 11:45. I wanted to ask each of you about, if taking the example of immunology research and immunotherapeutics that are coming through, how we address this. But one of the questions has come in about nutrition. How might nutrition influence the research we undertake? I might come to you, Anthony. Have you got any thoughts on that? And if we have time, I might have one priority from you, Mererid and Awen, in terms of immunotherapy research and therapeutics.
I can certainly speak from the kind of non-curative perspective and the impact of sarcopenia and cancer cachexia and outcomes. And we know that patients who have poor muscle quality and poor lean body mass do badly on cancer treatments, and the debate rages as to the extent to which that relates to nutritional deficit versus catabolic state. And I think there is a lot of work to be done around understanding which is to the forefront at any one particular point in a patient's journey, and how we can manipulate nutritional intake to best meet their needs at that particular moment in time. Just getting extra calories on board doesn't make a difference to outcomes. It's getting those calories on board when the patient has anabolic potential. And so again, that mixes back into, well, what impact is their radiochemotherapy having on that anabolic potential, and how, when we reach that peak of anabolic potential, how does that influence the immune response? So there, again, just reflecting on everything that's been said this morning, really great opportunities to interrogate that.
Thank you, Ashley. And I did want to come back, you know, to the two of you, because I know you'd have a lot to sort of contribute in terms of the other aspects of that research. But we are out of time. It's been a fantastic session. I think everybody who's listened this morning will see an exciting future for cancer research in Wales, and I think these three are going to be key in terms of implementation of that. So thanks everybody for joining, and really enjoy the rest of the conference. Thank you.